The Old Testament reading for this evening comes from Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, again, this is the word of the Lord. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. And they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort, shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, 2 of every sort shall come unto thee, to keep them alive. And take thou unto thee of all flood that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, so did he. I will only point out here, I think it's particularly relevant given the sermon text, that here we have this description of the 2 lines or the 2 seeds. You have the seed of a woman, the promised seed, and then you have the seed of the serpent in competition with one another. And it gets to the point in the world that it's so bad that, of course, the Lord has to flood the earth. And he describes the situation as, again, particularly bad. In verse 3, the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So he sets this time limit in which he's going to allow this wickedness to flourish until he brings judgment upon the world. And then down in verse 5, and God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, again, this is a fitting description of the state of the human heart. The scripture's description of human depravity, but it also is an indication that things had gone particularly bad by the time of Noah. And we'll see some of those characteristic features and what that looks like in the sermon text. And so, if you would, turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 3. I'll be preaching on the first 9 verses, but we'll read the entire chapter. 2 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. from such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women, laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. But thou hast fully known my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, charity, patience, persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, at Iconium, at Lystra, what persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. But continue thou in the things which thou hast learned and hast been assured of, knowing of whom thou hast learned them, and that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Well, this evening we're going to focus again, as I said, on those first 9 verses, and you have this contrast that Paul establishes in verse 10 between the sort of behaviors that he describes there and the model or example of his own ministry. Certainly in the first 9 verses, as throughout the pastoral epistles, Paul's major concern has to do with false teaching. He's dealing with, particularly in ecclesiastical context, and yet the principles that he establishes here are not limited to or in any way restricted to the church. And so you can see the same sorts of behaviors or characteristics in a culture, a society at large, not only the ecclesiastical, but also civil spheres, families, businesses, and so on. Now, I think it would be useful to look at these particular vices. We call this, when you get into particularly verse 2 and all the way through, you could even extend to verse 5. This is what would reasonably be described as a vice list. So we have in Paul repeatedly, we have virtue lists and we have vice lists. Another one of the famous vice lists appears, for example, in the latter portion of Romans chapter 1, and you just have him stack up terms for all of these vices. And so I want to look at those in detail. I think sometimes it's common to merely pass over it. We have this list, and so it's really easy to breeze through it, and we don't typically pause for each one of these items and consider, what does that actually mean? What concretely does that look like? And so I want to do that. And I think, as we cover this, you'll also have in the back of your mind from this morning the description in Psalm 12 of the sorts of people that were pervasive in his own society. It's not entirely disconnected. They're very similar themes here. So we'll begin with this vice list. Now, he says in verse 1, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. So we're going to look at first verse 1 to 5 is the type of people in these perilous times, the type of people. Verses 1 to 5. Now he says, first, he's referring to the last days. It's worth noting that when Paul says the last days, he has in view not some distant period in the future. He's talking about the world after the resurrection of Christ up until Christ's second coming. So he is living in the latter days, right? The Christian church exists in the latter days or the last days. And so he has this in mind. Now, again, like this morning in Psalm 12, he's not suggesting that every period in these last days is equally bad, there are no unique challenges to different periods. He's just saying that this is something that's a reality. This is present during the period bracketed by the resurrection of Christ and his second coming. And so he says, in these last days, in this time since the resurrection of Christ until the second coming, perilous times shall come. And that word perilous particularly means difficult. It's actually a little bit broader even than perilous might suggest. It's not merely that it's dangerous or that there are risks involved. It's that it's difficult. It's hard. And so there are hard times that come during this period. And as we often see, if you spend any time in social media online, weak men create hard times. And so the kinds of men here, these wicked men, create hard times. Why is it difficult? Why are these last times difficult? Well, he says, because for men shall be ... You have a pervasive, these characteristics are pervasive in society. You have people in the church, you have people in your political systems and your economic systems that are characterized by these qualities. And that's what makes it difficult. The first one he mentions, you actually notice it doesn't quite come through quite as clearly in your English translations, but if you'll notice the first one, it says, the first quality is lovers of their own selves. And then it says covetous, which actually is a word meaning lovers of silver, quite literally. And then you get on down to the end of this section. And once you move to the end of the section, you'll see things like lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. So this vice list is basically bracketed by references to misguided loves. That's the first, largely, generally speaking, the first category of vices with which Paul is concerned are misguided loves, people loving the wrong kinds of things. The first is lovers of their own selves. This, of course, is not condemning the sort of love which the scriptures elsewhere, the gospels command. So, for example, love your neighbor as yourself. We're required to love ourselves. That's not what's in view here. That's not what's being condemned. Indeed, it's important that people love themselves. The problem here is excessive self-love. Excessive self-love, something that is, again, a form of narcissism, that it exceeds all bounds of propriety, that this person believes that they love themselves so much that it's not just that they have an appropriate love of themselves, that they love themselves so much that every other relationship and every other consideration flies out the window. Nothing else matters. Second, they're described as lovers of silver, quite literally, or again, covetous. As in the first case, this is not condemning what we might call an appropriate quote unquote love of money. That is to say, money itself is not bad. Trying to acquire money is not bad. Indeed, it's an essential and necessary thing, both for what we might call our necessities, our basic needs in life, food, shelter, and so on, as well as to create sometimes a more beautiful existence. So you could have never had, for example, the architecture and art of the Christian West without immense amounts of wealth. You can't create that kind of beauty, or you can't create certain advanced or complex political systems without it. And so it's not that it's intrinsically bad. It's that, as in the first case, it is an excessive love of money. It's out of all proportion. It's that becomes the only thing that matters. We see descriptions of this, for example, in Luke chapter 16, verse 14. This same term is used to describe the Pharisees. Luke chapter 16, verse 14, Luke tells us, and the Pharisees also, who were covetous, which again is lovers of silver, heard all these things, and they derided him. Their love of money exceeds any ability to reason carefully about what Christ is saying and to take it seriously as it deserved. Or again, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, there's that famous passage where Paul warns, for the love of money, and again, this excessive love of money out of all proportion, is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So you begin this list then with misguided loves, misguided love of self, misguided love of money. He then describes the next characteristic of these people in this wicked age are boasters. Now, we might think of boasting, sometimes we might have in mind that these are people who are just proud, arrogant. We're going to get to another term that describes those sorts of people. That's not quite what this is. The term used here for boasters, it appears in classical literature, for example, in the Cyropaedia, this ancient manual basically for instructing young men, and it refers to those who claim that they have abilities that they don't have, and so they're groundlessly boasting about themselves. Another example is the Latin play Miles Gloriosus by the Latin playwright Plautus, And it's based on actually a Greek version with this term in it. And the main character of that play is this soldier who brags about all of his military accomplishments, which aren't actually real. He didn't do any of those things. It's just completely made up. This should remind you, I think, a little bit of the sermon this morning. This is another example of what we would be talking about when we say vanities. When you have people speaking vanity, each man with his neighbor, it's not real. It's going on at some sort of public forum and proclaiming your own abilities, your own accomplishments, when it's not actually a real thing. It doesn't actually exist. It's merely a persona that is artificially created in order to, again, elicit some response. More specifically, of course, you have examples in the New Testament that hint at the same sort of thing. So this term is used in James chapter 4, verses 13 to 16. And James chapter 4, verses 13 to 16, James says, "Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city, and continue there a year, and buy and sell, and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil." And so the idea that James here is getting at is, again, the same sort of thing that we see in the classical literature, is that someone's boasting about something that isn't real. It's not tangible. It's not concrete yet. So they're saying that something about the future as though it's guaranteed, and that belongs to me, and that's mine, and I can claim that as my accomplishment, when in fact you can't, because it hasn't been realized yet. And that would be a form of boasting. Or again, 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. The term pride here. So, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. So, we have inordinate self love, inordinate love of money. We have boasting, that is to say, lying about accomplishments. And next, we have the proud. This is slightly different than the previous. Just to look at some examples, James 4:6 and 1 Peter 5:5, citing the Greek version of the Proverbs. You all know famously, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so proud here is the opposite of someone who is humble. You see, again, same thing. At the beginning of Luke, in Luke chapter 1, verse 51, we read, "He hath showed strength with his arm. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts." And that at least starts to get at a little bit what this pride is when he says the imagination of their hearts. Typically, in classical literature, this term has two sides. On the one hand, it suggests the sort of arrogance that is lavish or prodigal in its use of resources. It describes the sort of person who, again, in the imaginations of their heart, are going to build this grand lifestyle. And on the other hand, it includes an aspect of insolence. That is to say, violence against people who get in this person's way. The proud person, by his nature, looks at anybody that gets in his particular way of living the way that he wants to live as a threat that must be destroyed. You can think of how this applies to really any of the second table of commandments. So you think of it how it might lead to murder in an extreme case. A person who's proud is insolent. They're going to get their way. This person's a threat to that, so I'm going to kill that person to remove him from my path. You can think of it in terms of seventh commandment violations and rape, that you're taking something just because this person thinks that he has a right to it, he deserves it. Same thing with theft. This arrogant, proud person thinks, I have a right to that person's property. I deserve it. It belongs to me. And so he takes it. That's the sort of person that we have in view when he's talking about the proud. The very opposite of this is that which is expressed, for example, in Isaiah 66, when the Lord says, "But to this one I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit, and who trembles at my word. So this brokenhearted person who's humbled before the Lord, seeking the Lord's ways, is the very opposite of this person who is both prodigal and insolent. Next, we're warned against blasphemers. Now, we typically think of this as an expression of, evil language concerning God Himself, and it certainly includes that. So, you see this in Acts chapter 6, for example. We have the false accusations in this case, but you'll see the use of the word blasphemy. Then they suborned men, which said, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." That is to say, against religious things, chiefly and preeminently God, and then, of course, Moses as a representative of Scripture and the first 5 books of the Bible. So he's here talking about people who have no regard, in one sense, for holy things, but it surely actually extends beyond this. It includes all kinds of evil speech. The suggestion of the term is it's designed to harm. It's designed to harm innocent people. So Paul actually uses this term earlier in 1 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 13. He describes himself, he says, who was before a blasphemer and a persecutor and injurious, but I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. Now, at the time, to be fair, Paul, in his mind, did not think that he was saying something that placed him at odds with God. In fact, quite the opposite. He thought he was serving God by persecuting Christians. But in the pursuit of persecuting Christians, he said things that were specifically designed to harm these innocent people. And that would be of the nature of blasphemy in the broad sense. And so Paul has in view here, certainly, again, yes, those who actually speak evil against God, but more broadly, he's including those who speak evil with the express purpose of harming innocent people. Now, back in 2 Timothy 3, so we have lovers of self, lovers of money, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers. And now we get a list, or now the list shifts a little bit. And the following sets of terms uh, begin with basically the way I'll describe it. So, if you know anything about the Greek alphabet, so it starts with many of these terms with an alpha, what we call an alpha privative, and it basically just means not that. It's a negation. So the following sets of items, many of them, not all of them, but a great many of them, all begin with that alpha privative, saying they're lacking this virtue. So it's not just that there are positive vices here. He's pointing out that these sorts of people, the world that he's describing, this world of the latter days that is particularly evil, is marked by people who are completely devoid of the necessary virtues, and they have instead these vices. And so when we look at each of these, we'll describe the vice that's in view, but because it's a negation, it allows us also to say what the corresponding virtue is. It's really easy to point out what the corresponding virtue would be. And so Paul indirectly is saying, okay, well, this is a society that you don't want. This is a church, a world that you don't want to live in. It's really bad. And so what would the opposite of that look like? What would the presence of these virtues look like? And that's the kind of world that you want to build. And so we'll start with, he says, disobedient to parents. And that's, of course, suggested in the English word disobedient, right? It's the absence of obedience. This one, of course, is among all the items in this list, probably the most, probably the easiest to understand. I think, obviously, even young children from a very early age know what this means. The opposite of disobedience is simply obedience. Children should obey their parents. They should do what their parents tell them to do. This is part of honoring their parents, and therefore it is at the core of Fifth Commandment obedience that you listen to your parents, you do what your parents say, and this, of course, is a commandment with a promise of long life and prosperity as far as it shall serve for God's glory and their own good. This extends, I might add, in our circles, we tend to reiterate this. This extends backwards in time. So, to some extent, we are trying to walk in the ways of our fathers insofar as they are not violating moral law. And so we're honoring and we're obeying those who came before us. It is part of this fallen, wicked system that Paul is describing, this particularly evil era. It's marked and characterized by disobedience to parents and a rejection, then, really, of all hierarchical authority. Next, he has what it says here is unthankful. Unthankful people. That is to say, they are lacking something. Again, these are all privatives. They are lacking what? They are lacking gratitude for good done toward that person. So the person who is unthankful is simply one who is lacking gratitude for good done toward him or her. We read in Luke chapter 6, verse 35, an example of what this means. Christ is teaching here, and he says, "But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful," that's that word, "and to the evil." So the unthankful, then, by definition, are those who do not give anything in return for a good done to the person. So we have this lack of gratitude. Next, we have this description of unholy. So disobedient parents, unthankful, unholy. Again, sometimes I think we tend to see this as a little bit abstract, but the opposite, or the obviously the opposite of unholy here would be holiness, and this unholiness in view here is equivalent to that which is profane. The unholy is the profane. That is to say, it's that which violates God and his religious institutions. It is the person who has no concern or regard for heavenly religious things. In the previous pastoral epistle in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, Paul hints at this. He says, "Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy," there's a term, "and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers," and so on. And so the unholy is effectively equivalent to the profane, and it involves a rejection of those things which are holy, those things which are of God, including, in that particular case, the law of God. Next, we have without natural affection. Again, here is this privative. So you have the lack of natural affection. This is suggesting, then, Paul saying, you ought to have natural affection. You, I think, probably have heard a great deal of this from Reverend Spangler on this theme of natural affection. The absence of natural affection simply means having no particular love for one's own, and that extends outward in concentric circles. There's actually a brief passage from B.B. Warfield on this particular term where he touches on this, and it's useful. But if we have the natural affection in view here, it is something that suggests a level of passion, right? A level of emotional commitment. It's not something that's merely intellectual. It's this love for one's own that should come out just again naturally. That it's something that as human beings we simply should have, and that should just come as second nature. So a mother's love for her child, that's normal. That's expected. Mothers typically love their children. That's healthy and natural, right? Parents, children have regard for, love for their parents. This is natural and normal. When we live in a world that is characterized by, not individual instances that happens, but that is characterized by a lack of natural affection, when you have, let's say, mothers who abort their own children, you have children who murder their parents, when you have a complete disregard in the broad sense for those that are our own, because again, this extends outward in concentric circles. If you don't have any concern for your own people, you have no concern for those who have a common heritage to you, That is a very sick society. Something has gone terribly wrong, and it is terribly unhealthy. So we see without natural affection. Next, we see truce breakers. Now, this term truce breakers, it's actually again a little bit broader than breaking a truce because it's a privative, remember? It's the lack of truce making. It's the lack of truce making, not just truce breaking. So if Paul is condemning the lack of truce making, he's suggesting then that it is a virtue for us to try to reconcile with other people. The word here actually evokes or brings to mind the uh, act of um, pouring out wine in a ceremony where two parties who are in conflict with each other come together to reach a peace. And Paul is condemning people who are saying, I refuse to do that. I refuse to sit down with that person and to try to reconcile with them. I refuse to sit down with that person and to try to reach some peace with them. So anybody who is looking at those who are his enemies, really, this means he is implacable. He just cannot in any way be pacified. There's no way that we can reach a peace with this person. He irrationally refuses all overtures to reconciliation. And I choose that word irrationally intentionally. You'll see, of course, most of these characteristics, and all of them by the nature of vices, are irrational. It's an irrational rejection of willing to actually talk to another person as a human being, even if we disagree, even if we can't come to some kind of truth. Sometimes it's just not possible. The differences and the disagreements are so severe that it prevents any kind of unity. That does happen. But for someone not even to try, not even to be willing to sit down with a person with whom they disagree and treat them as a human being and to try to understand where they're coming from and why they think the way that they think, that again is a sign of something very, very sick in a society. And you see, of course, as a result, increasing fragmentation in the world, and that only generates more hostility and hatred. Instead of a willingness to have honest conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, but honest conversations that are, as far as we are able, fulfilled with respect. His next vice that he describes are false accusers. This one actually isn't a privative. This is one item dropped into this list of privatives of these negations, and it itself is not. So, false accusers. Now, you might say, well, how does that differ from blasphemers in the broad sense? Because we said earlier, blasphemers, people that sometimes we can say they're slanderers. They're saying things that are designed to hurt innocent people. Well, this term is actually a little bit narrower than that. It's not focused as much on the consequences, the harmful effect of the speech. It's focused on the action of false accusing itself. So this term, diaboloi, is indeed it's the word for diabolos, the devil. Right. This is what the devil does. It's the people who act like the devil. And what is this characteristic feature of the devil? Why do we call him the devil? Well, because he levels accusations, either that are false accusations or that are accusations that may be true but were already forgiven against the people of God. That's the nature of this slander. And so, whereas a blasphemer is of someone who it doesn't necessarily mean it's an accusation, it could be anything that you say that's designed to harm an innocent person. It could be something simply that's embarrassing but isn't a charge of any kind of misconduct. Um, Diaboloi, slanderers, false accusers, is actually narrower than that. It's someone who is making accusations against people, and those accusations are either false or those accusations have already been forgiven and should be left alone and swept away, and God has forgiven them, and so we ought to as well. These are the sorts of people that, again, it's not hard when you look at this list. It's easy to come up with examples that you have seen in everyday life, and I don't mean to keep harping on it I know I mentioned it this morning, but we think, again, the social media world, it's really easy to find examples of people who are going to level these sorts of false accusations and use it as a weapon. It's speech that is designed as a tool for obtaining and advancing one's power. It's not about the righteousness of the cause, even. It's just merely trying to get that guy. He's my enemy. And so I need to level some false accusation against him just because. The next vice, we're back on this list of privatives, of negations. He says, incontinent. We don't typically use that term in this context these days. Really, this term means lacking self-control. Indeed, more generally, it's actually lacking control entirely. It's an absence of any kind of control, but that starts with self-control. So it's a person that has no mastery or command over himself, and therefore he can have no mastery or command over anything else in life. And again, when you have a world that is characterized by that kind of lack of self-control, that if the people that are leading the church or the people that are leading the state have no kind of self-control, they're just led along by whatever passions, then eventually you're going to be in trouble. There's no order, there's no organization, there's no direction to it. And then he says, he describes these people, this society, the world in which he lives. These people are fierce. These people are fierce. Now, it's interesting to me that term "fierce" in certain contexts and in certain quarters these days is used as though it were a virtue. That if someone is "quote unquote" fierce, as though it's a good thing, it isn't. Fierce is another way we could translate this is someone who is wild, someone who is savage. The opposite of this, when we think of, again, in terms of opposite, because it is a privation. So if Paul is condemning this being fierce or being wild or being savage, well, what is the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of it is being, in the case of animals, for example, to take a image from animals, it's like having a tame animal, right? So there's a world of difference between encountering this savage bear in the woods, this fierce wild bear in the woods, and then having, uh, a little dog at home that is house trained and is perfectly tame. It's a completely different thing. When you come to plants, this is the word for a cultivated plant as opposed to a wild plant. It's something that somebody has given attention and care to it so that it produces fruits. And indeed, I think that's actually a little bit more of a helpful image here as we move from animals to plants, and eventually I'll describe how it's applied to human beings in literature. But when you think about plants, if you've ever seen the World War I movie, that 1917, I believe it's called, if I'm not mistaken. And if you watch that film, there is this recurring theme of the trees. So you will see that some of the main characters there, one of them says, keep your eyes on the tree line to the man that he's with. And if you watch throughout that film, trees play a crucial role in the storytelling. And at one point, you'll notice that there are these cultivated trees, right? This orchard the trees have been destroyed by war. That's intentional. The suggestion is that when you lose your cultivated plants, when you lose these cultivated trees, something has gone wrong with your civilization. In that case, it's war. But it's a sign that something is very unhealthy, something is very wrong, something is fierce, wild, savage. In other words, to bring it now to human beings, it's that which is uncivilized. It's that which is uncivilized. That is what Paul is condemning here. He's promoting and commending civilization and condemning that which isn't civilized. In fact, we can use the Latin term. It's almost the exact opposite of the Latin term humanitas. Humanitas, which would basically a lack of or absence of humanitas would be a lack of culture, a lack of refinement, a lack of good breeding, as they used to say, including a lack of liberal education and civility. So it may seem foreign to the way moderns read the New Testament, but it seems here that Paul is actually commending, in opposition to being fierce, wild, or savage, he's commending civilization, including things like a liberal arts education. And of course, that I think particularly is relevant for the Christian school that will be starting this fall. This isn't just something that we arbitrarily choose. It's actually something that Paul seems to commend, at least in principle, that we want a world that is led by men who are civil, who act like gentlemen, who are cultured, as opposed to wild, savage people. And you can consider, again, when Paul is thinking in terms of leadership in the church or leadership in the state, it's not hard, even going back to this morning's sermon, to think about the sorts of people, the worthless, vain people, these worthless people who have risen to a level of leadership, that look at who's leading us, look at who's leading us in whether, again, ecclesiastically or economically or civilly. Our current elite class is characterized by people who actually aren't educated in this way. They aren't civilized. They have no kind of civility or culture, and they don't care because they found that they can get by without it. But of course, that again makes the world a worse place. It makes it a more savage and a wilder place. Next, he talks about those who are despisers of those that are good. We could add here that it's not just despisers of those that are good, it's despisers of anything that is good. That is to say, they have the term again is a privative. It's the absence of love for the good. It's the absence of love for the good. So again, consider they love themselves inordinately, as we started out saying. They love money inordinately. We'll go on to see that they love pleasure inordinately, but they don't have any love whatsoever for the good, the true, and the beautiful for its own sake. They don't value something that's good for its own sake. And this, of course, when I say good, I don't just mean moral good, although it includes that. It's more expansive. So if a man looks at a work of art and it's an objectively good work of art, if his soul is healthy, he's not sitting there asking the question, okay, that's only valuable to me insofar as it helps advance my power or interests. If he has a healthy soul, he can look at it and say, actually, that's beautiful for its own sake. That's a good thing for its own sake. That's a good work of art. Or we might think of certain businesses that are valuable, certain industries that are valuable, and perhaps they're not the most attractive to the world, but they are intrinsically useful and they are good. And in a healthy society, those industries, those works would be valued for their own sake because they're intrinsically good, not necessarily a means or an instrument of obtaining more power. Or again, we think of the true, right? Something that's true, these go hand in hand with the good, is that in a healthy society and for a person with a healthy soul, he's able to look at true claims about the world and he's able to value them because they're true for no other reason than that they are true. That's a good enough reason to love it. But in this spiritually sick society that Paul is describing, all of that goes away. It's filled with people who don't actually love those things for their own sake. They do not love the good, the true, and the beautiful for their own sakes. They only value it insofar as it is a tool to get them what they want. Next, we have traitors, verse 4. This, again, isn't actually the next three. This and the following two are not privatives. They're not negations. They're just dropped in here after this list of negations. So traitors, again, very easy one. Chiefly we have in mind when you think traitor in the context of Scripture, no doubt you think of people like Judas. The idea here is people who hand over other people for their own safety and their own gain. And that surely is common these days. that someone is willing to turn another person in, hand him over, at least in this case, not yet to necessarily civil authorities, although that may be true in some cases, but to hand this person over to the mob, to hand this person over to the social media mob, to hand this person over to, let's say, the ecclesiastical courts, that we have a world where it's hard, it becomes increasingly difficult to trust people because you get betrayed all the time. And I think many of us have experienced this, that someone is willing to save their own skin or to, again, perhaps advance their own name in an institution or in society. They're willing to hand over people with whom they had been friends. And they know what's going to happen to those people. They know that it's going to hurt them in the church. They know it's going to hurt them in their relationships. They know it's going to hurt them in their jobs and so on. And they don't care. That's the characteristic of a traitor, and that is a characteristic of a traitorous and therefore untrustworthy society. He next describes, he mentions the heady. Heady, again, not a term that we typically use. The idea here is people who are rash or reckless. They're heady. They jump headlong into things without thinking about it. They take unnecessary risks. You can think, again, going back to this morning sermon, when I mentioned we live in the influencer world, you can think of people who make increasingly dangerous choices just to keep an audience. You have someone, it's constantly trying to one-up each other to do something that is more obscene, that is more shocking, that is more dangerous. And it's not like a lot of thought has gone into this about, okay, well, is this productive for society? Is this in my long-term best interest? All of that's gone out the window. Instead, you have people simply acting on impulse, rashly and recklessly, because they see the shiny object that they're trying to get, and so they're going to jump for it, and then they're going to think about it later. Again, when you have a society that is characterized by this kind of rashness, this recklessness, it's not good for anybody. It hurts the people who are reckless. It hurts the people around them, and it becomes a less peaceful world. Similarly, conjoined with heady here is the term high-minded. And doesn't quite mean arrogant. We've previously discussed the proud. It's not quite that, although sometimes it can include that. It has in view particularly someone who's insane, right? Someone who's mad, someone who has lost their mind. And this can be, particularly, though not exclusively, in the form of they can be delusional. Right? They are delusional about who they are, and they're delusional about the world. And this, like all of these characteristics, when I mentioned earlier this morning that it's like a cancer, it spreads, and you can have social conditions that aggravate sin in a way that this becomes a bigger problem than it otherwise would have been. We think of when people talk about the mental health crisis, and yes, there are all kinds of environmental issues there. There can be genetic issues there, but part of it too is there are social circumstances that when you incentivize the kind of rash, reckless behavior that I just described with the previous term, when you get these other vices proliferating, then it's easy for people to lose their minds. It's easy for people to become insane and delusional about the world. It's a contagion. And that's one explanation for why we have increased rates of mental illness in our world when you have things, again, like social media promoting, encouraging, incentivizing a world that fits this description. It's not how we were meant to live. And then finally, we return at the end of verse 4 to misguided loves, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. This, in some sense, can summarize the entire list in the same way that First John talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and pride of life. And finally, verse 5, the sorts of people all throughout this list, they're not necessarily people who have cast off all forms of religion, right? So he says they have a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. They have a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. That is to say, from external appearances, they maintain certain religious rites, ceremonies, symbols, language, but it's devoid of any actual substance because they wear religion like a skin suit. It's completely devoid of substance in the way that Psalm 12 earlier we talked about, that these people speak in a way that's completely devoid of substance, and the language is merely designed to elicit the reaction that they want to elicit. It's not about the truth. It's not about the substance of the thing. It's about using external forms because it makes them look good, or it helps them get certain votes, or it helps them get certain customers for their, for their brand. I one example that immediately came to mind, and I'm not necessarily meaning to pick on any one person here, but it's just because it's easy to find examples. It's not gonna take much for you to look out at the world and say, well, that's just kind of by default the way things work. You can think of athletes, celebrities, whatever, who have the form of godliness. They use these external religious forms, but it's completely devoid of any kind of substance or content. One that immediately came to mind is our current press secretary, is that she wears the cross necklace, but of course the fact is she lived with her now husband before they were married, lived with her boyfriend, had a child out of wedlock, and none of that occurred to them as being in any way problematic. And there's a form of godliness, talks about prayer, talks about religion, talks about going to church, wears the cross necklace, but completely devoid of any substance or content. It's not like it actually there's nothing there behind it. Well, Paul says in verse 5, as far as the church is concerned, from such turn away. You don't want to have a church that is characterized by those features. You don't even want a society characterized by those features, but of course, that's not under the power and the authority of church leadership. So we've seen the particular characteristics. Now we get to verses 6 to 7. This is the behavior of those sorts of people. Again, Paul has in view primarily the church, but not exclusively. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Well, first, it's worth asking, what does Paul mean when he's talking about these quote unquote silly women? Well, he's talking about, as he says, those women who are loaded up with sin so much, they're so loaded up with sin and guilt that they're easy to manipulate. I mentioned a little bit ago that the spread of mental illness and those sorts of problems. If you look at young women, particularly, of course, it's both genders in increasing numbers, but if you look at the number of young women who are on, antidepressant medication, that sort of thing, it has grown rapidly. And it's not to say that there's never a time and place for, help like that, but it is to say that there's something wrong with your society. There's something terribly sick with it when that becomes almost a default phenomenon in a generation of young women. It also, of course, goes hand in hand, I think, with turning to alternative religious practices as a way to deal with guilt, as a way to deal with a sense of shame in things like Eastern mysticism and meditation, like yoga or astrology, or taking up certain political causes. All of this is designed to get rid of their guilt. And subsequently, these quote unquote silly women are easily manipulated by this kind of nonsense, much of which is demonic, to take them even deeper into the problem instead of out of it. They are, as Paul describes, led away by various lusts. That is to say, they are governed by their emotions and passions rather than governing those emotions and passions. We might say a part of the problem here, it's not the only problem, but part of the problem here when you have a generation characterized again by these quote unquote silly women is they didn't have fathers who raised them well. They don't have husbands who lead them well. This is what you get when you have Isaiah 3. And of course, that goes back even earlier in the list to disobedience to parents. When you have the inversion of all appropriate hierarchy, you are led by women and children, and they end up becoming these sorts of people. And those sorts of people are easily manipulated by the worst kinds of people. Consequently, these silly women are ever learning. They're into all the latest fads for the well-being of their mind, body, and spirit, right? They'll read the email newsletter that comes through. They'll read what's the latest fad on social media or the latest book because all of their friends are reading it. They're going to watch the latest podcast because that's what their friends are doing. And so they're imbibing all of this without any boundaries or regulation on it. And they're soaking it all in, thinking that's going to solve my problem. That's going to make me feel better. That's going to deal with the sense of shame that I have. But they are never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Why? Because, in one sense, given the nature of their sins, that would be exclusive and restrictive. It would require them to give up certain beliefs, behaviors, certain practices. It would require them to draw a line beyond which they could not go, and that would impact their ability to form relationships. I think this is particularly why Paul describes it as a predominantly female problem, right? Because women are appropriately more prone to building relationships with each other. That's a good and healthy thing. But when this sort of sin enters in, it can be incredibly destructive because they're not willing to actually set limits or restrictions on their relationships or clearly draw a line in the sand and say, I believe this and I don't believe that. Because again, it would be excessively exclusive and they don't want to restrict those relationships. And so the kind of people that Paul has described in this list, the worst kinds of people, are able to come into a church or a society at large when it's characterized by such women, and they are able to manipulate the situation for their own gain, and it makes it all the worse. And so we'll close then with the example that Paul gives in verses 8 and 9 from the Old Testament. He says, now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt mind, reprobate concerning the faith, but they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. So he's saying that these two men that he's talking about are the names for Pharaoh's guys, right? These are Pharaoh's magicians that opposed Moses and Aaron. And just as they opposed Moses, so they will oppose the truth. So they will oppose Paul's restrictive beliefs about virtues and vices and godliness. They will come along and they will say to an audience that is already primed to receive them, these silly women, they're going to teach them, oh, no, you don't have to be restrictive in that sense. No, you don't have to be exclusive in that sense. No, you don't have to draw boundaries there like that. Right? That's uncomfortable, and that creates conflict between you and your friends, and we don't want that. So you don't have to listen to Paul. You can ignore him when he starts talking about these virtues and vices. And like these men, Pharaoh's men, the modern false leaders are corrupted in their mind. That is to say, they're perverted in how they think about the world. And so they are disqualified, Paul says, concerning the faith. Now, he does say, to bring us to the end of this passage, and indeed it should connect with the end of this morning's passage. You should see the similarity. What's the solution to this problem? Paul says these men will not get very far. Indeed, he says that their folly will be apparent to everyone. And when he talks about their folly or their foolishness, it's really their madness almost. Like we saw earlier in the list, right? These people are insane. They've lost their minds. He says that their madness, their insanity will be apparent to everyone. It'll be clear to everyone that they are corrupt in their minds. It'll be clear to everyone that they have lost their minds. And it will happen relatively quickly. They can't go on living like this and acting like this without people noticing. But he says that it will be as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so that these also resist the truth. And he says, but they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. Well, how did the folly of Pharaoh's magicians become apparent to everyone? How did it become apparent to everyone that they had lost their minds and that they were acting insanely? Well, it required, just as in this morning sermon, it required miraculous divine intervention. It required supernatural divine intervention. Pharaoh's magicians were able to operate with impunity until, of course, God starts plaguing Egypt and the plagues are so obviously divine, and Pharaoh's magicians can't keep up, that they look like fools. It's apparent that they're willingly, knowingly trying to fight against an almighty supernatural power, which is stupid. And that's, of course, what ultimately brought them down. So the solution that Paul is offering here is, yes, it's an appropriate warning about, okay, you don't want this kind of world. And so you can think about what kind of world do you want to build. But it's also true that he's pointing us to the only solution that the psalmist offers us this morning. Supernatural divine intervention, because again, salvation belongs to the Lord. Let's pray.